10. Gore's Tome. This item gives enemies a 4% chance to drop gold equivalent to a small chest. Unlike a lot of other items on this list, Gore's Tome doesn't directly deal damage, but instead it helps indirectly. This item significantly decreases the looting phase in the early game. Think about all the time you waste in the first few stages just waiting for enemies to spawn. It adds up to quite a bit, and if you're full looting a stage, it can take a really long time. If you're using a rushing strategy, often gold is the biggest bottleneck. By having Gore's Tome, you can expect to get 3 to 4 extra chests on every stage. Gore's Tome is not affected by this decrease, and it makes farming a lot more efficient. With Gore's Tome, you're going to be looting faster, enemies are going to be weaker, and you're going to be getting extra items, which are going to be making you stronger. The main downside to this item is it falls off pretty heavily on loop runs, since gold is often no longer an issue, but early game this is one of, if not the best item you can find. 9. Wax Quail. Jumping boosts you forward 10 meters, or 33 feet for you filthy Americans. This item is really good until it gets you killed. 1 or 2 will grant a significant speed boost and will allow you to traverse the map a lot faster and dodge a lot more enemies. This item delivers insane value to mobility, and that's huge. As you guys know, mobility is everything in this game, but be careful because that can actually work to this item's detriment. Once you jump, you are locked into moving in that direction, and you give up control of the character for about a second. This can sometimes put you in a bad situation. If you're not experienced with Quail, and sometimes even if you are, you can end up trying to dodge something only to move into another attack. Each time you stack Quail, the more control you lose. I think 2 Quails is the sweet spot. Sometimes you can get away with 3, but I wouldn't go any higher unless I was really desperate for mobility. This item also has a hidden mechanic with head stompers. By Quail jumping on a slope, you can perform what's called a trimp and go launching into the sky. And to clarify, I said launching into the sky, not launching into this guy. Number 8, Ignition Tank. This is one of my favorite items in the game. Replaces the Ignite effect with a stronger burn, dealing 300% more damage over time. In other words, burns are 4 times stronger. This item opens the floodgates to a number of synergies, like Artificer's Flamebolt, Flamethrower, Molten Perforator, and Fire aspects, but the easiest to achieve and probably the most effective is with Gasoline. Gas on its own is a really powerful area of effect item in the early game. I think gas is the number 1 best white item to have on stage 1. It just melts everything. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale very well, and it merely tickles the enemies by stage 4. But when combined with ignition tanks, gas stays relevant a lot longer. But when you start stacking these bad boys, interesting things start to happen. Stacking gasoline on its own does 3 things. It increases the radius, it increases damage, and it increases duration. An increase in damage and duration is exponential value because you calculate total damage by multiplying damage times duration. Now multiply that again for each ignition tank, and you're looking at some pretty high damage burns with extremely long durations. This is unique to gas since it's the only item in the game that lets you increase ignite damage and duration. This is such a strong combination. The only limiting factor is rarity. You not only need to find an ignition tank, but a gas printer as well to make full use out of it. But when you can pull it off, it's one of the most effective combos in the game. Number 7, Shuriken. Using your primary skill allows you to throw out a shuriken dealing 400% damage. Now this has a lot of different uses. The most obvious is with melee survivors like Merc, Loader, and sometimes Acrid. These guys can really struggle with flying enemies or enemies that are far away. Shuriken is a great solution to this. It's not a lot of damage, but it's just enough to proc bans, so this is extremely useful on survivors that don't have abilities with high enough damage to do that. The big exception to this is Railgunner, whose sniper shot is already a really strong band proc, so hitting something with the shuriken instead will result in lower damage. For this reason, I usually opt to scrap shurikens on Railgunner, but on everyone else, it's great. Shuriken's real power comes from stacking. In a lot of ways, this item is the reincarnation of the original sticky bombs. Each stack will increase shuriken's damage by 100% and will reduce their cooldown. Once again, exponential value. This isn't too crazy for the first few stacks. You need to invest in it heavily to see a large impact, but once you get into the 5+ range, you'll really start noticing it. Shuriken is a way of life, and it requires commitment. Real quick, if you are enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. The alimony payments are due soon, and to be honest, I'm pretty fucked. Number 6, Will-o'-the-Wisp. Killing an enemy creates an explosion dealing 350% damage to nearby enemies. This is quite similar to Ignition Tank, except it has 2 advantages. The first is it's 1 item. With gas ignition tank builds, oftentimes you'll find 1 item, but not the other. This is not the case with Wisp. There's no setup involved, it just works. Secondly, it has a 1.0 proc coefficient, meaning you can fire ATGs, stickies, whatever your little friggin' heart desires. My favorite combo with Wisp is Ukulele, which I won't get into too much because that item is coming up in just a sec, but essentially you can do massive area of effect damage from hitting enemies with the explosion and then hitting them again from proccing Ukulele. It's a super strong combo, and it gets even crazier if you happen to have Sentient Meat Hook. The cool thing about proccing Hook from Wisp is it hits more enemies and does more damage than Uke, but Hook also pulls the enemies closer together, putting them in range for the next Wisp explosion. The Wisp Meat Hook combo is my favorite in the game. It just works on so many levels. If you haven't tried it, you definitely should. You don't need the DLC for it. Go fucking plug in your Nintendo, have a jolly good time. But the real value from Will-O-the-Wisp comes from stacking it. It significantly increases damage 280% per stack, and it increases radius. Once again, it's our good old friend exponential stacking. And for this reason, Will-O-Wisp is the best printer in the game. If you find one, just start feeding it. You'll be glad you did. Number 5, Ukulele. 25% chance to chain lightning for 80% total damage on up to 3 targets. Like we just mentioned with Will-O-the-Wisp, this item is great for proc builds. It's such an iconic item, and I wish the description actually told you what it did. I was so confused the first time I picked this item up. This item is better the stronger the attack. Proccing it on someone like Commando is alright and can allow for more potential proc chains assuming you have the items, but if you're punching with Loader or sniping with Railgunner, proccing Uke basically allows you to kill an entire horde of enemies. It's a 4-for-1 special. Now the downside to this item is it's not all that good on Mithrix. You can use it a little bit in phase 2, but it's not going to do that much. However, this item's Void counterpart, Polyloot, is ridiculous for proc chains and single target damage. Yes, Polyloot is a Void item and this video is about greens, but I bring it up because it gives Ukulele even more intrinsic value. The fact that all of your area of effect can become single target damage later on in the run makes it a lot more versatile. That doesn't always happen, but a lot of the time it does. Number 4, ATG. 10% chance to fire a missile dealing 300% total damage. Now the total damage part of that is a big distinction. Shuriken, for example, is base damage. Total damage means it's multiplied by the ability that procced it. So if you do a punch with Loader that deals 3,000 damage and proc an ATG off it, it will do 9,000 damage. If you had 2 ATGs, it would be 18,000 damage. Once again, this is very much an item that benefits from stacking. It's 300% additional damage each stack, which is pretty busted. Like Ukulele, this is more effective with stronger abilities since its damage is multiplied by the original hit. This item is a staple for proc chain builds. It has great multipliers and a 1.0 proc coefficient. Combining it with stuff like stickies, ukes, perforators will give it quite a bit of value. It also has a very strong synergy with bands. Sometimes. If a strong ATG procs bands, it will often one-shot whatever it comes in contact with. However, this can be tricky to pull off since bands have a 10-second cooldown. What will usually happen is the initial attack will proc bands, and then if you go on to proc an ATG, it will hit the target before bands are ready. There's 2 ways to get around this issue. The first is by hitting your target right before bands go off cooldown. If you do it correctly, you'll proc an ATG, and by the time it hits, bands will be ready. The problem with doing this is it's wildly inconsistent. It really only has a 10% chance of occurring, and your timing needs to be spot on. The other way is with Blast Shower. This equipment instantly recharges bands, so if you have this equipment, you can just play normally until you proc an ATG, then just use Blast Shower right before the ATG hits, and boom, you have a really strong band proc. Number 3, Kaijaro Band. This and the next item I've talked about a lot recently, so I won't get into it too much, but ostensibly what this item does is it creates a mini AoE firestorm dealing 300% total damage over a few seconds. Again, total damage is very good. You can get insane multipliers like we just talked about with ATG, but unlike ATG, it has a 100% chance to proc on any ability dealing 400% or more base damage. And again, this is balanced with a 10-second cooldown. One very cool thing you can do with the Fireband specifically is skip phase 4 of Mithrix. If you didn't know, there are a few frames in between phases 3 and 4 where Mithrix is vulnerable. If you kill Mithrix with a Fireband when he jumps to the center of the arena, it will put out a constant hitbox and damage him during those frames. There are multiple ways to skip phase 4, but Fireband is by far the easiest. Number 2, Runald Band. This is more or less interchangeable with Kaijaro depending on what mood I'm in. Both bands have the same cooldown, and both bands are obtained for free on Abandoned Aqueduct. The main difference is the method of damage. Fireband is 300% damage per stack and can be applied to multiple enemies over time. Iceband is 250% damage per stack and can only hit one enemy, but applies all damage instantly. On paper, it may seem like Fire is better because it does more damage and can hit multiple enemies, but there's multiple factors involved. Very rarely will you get the full effect from Fireband since it requires the enemy to not move. Fireband also cannot utilize focus crystals and crowbars in the same way Iceband can. There's many factors involved and it's really impossible to quantify which is better. I think the best thing you can do is have a healthy mix of both. Real quick, a few honorable mentions: Old Guillotine, Shipping Request Form, and Regen Scrap. Guillotine is an incredible item on looped runs once every enemy is elite, but for my playstyle, I tend not to loop that often, and during the first 5 stages, elites are a lot less common. Good item, just not for me. Same is true with Shipping Request and Regen Scrap. Both of these items are investments, and the longer the run goes, the more value you'll see from them. Both get you free items, and they're both good in non-looped runs. They're just not quite top 10 material. But the number 1 green item in Risk of Rain 2 has got to be Hopu Feather. It's very simple. It gives you an extra jump, but goddamn is it effective. Enemies in this game are dumb and they don't know how to deal with vertical mobility. A universal way to dodge most things in this game is just by getting in the air. This even works on Mithrix. 1 feather turns this boss fight into a joke. 90% of his attacks can't hit you if you're in the air. Feathers prevent fall damage and they allow for easier map traversal, and just a whole lot less damage overall. Now, I'm sure this pick is colored by the fact I play a lot of Eclipse. It's equally as effective in Monsoon, but the game is just more forgiving when you take damage, so feathers are a bit less important. But either way, I think green items are really interesting to talk about since there's such a range in quality. When I'm scrapping white items, I always have a hard time choosing what I want to get rid of because I feel like everything is kind of helpful, but with greens, it either feels like a god item or it's contributing absolutely nothing to the build. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think of this kind of content. I always feel a little bit bad about posting top 10s because I think it's pretty cliche. I've tried to innovate a little bit, but I don't know. Let me know if I'm milking a dead horse. Milking a dead horse. Wow, I actually wrote that. I made this script like a week ago, and I genuinely can't tell if that's me trying to be funny or if I'm just an idiot. Big thank you to the members for supporting the channel. Got some juicy stuff on the way, and I'll catch you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.